So this, I'm sure, is what you've come for. Adam Boddison has been such a friend to NGA over the last few years. And Adam, you've turned up at a number of our events, both our national conference in person in Birmingham, ICC, but also joined us at another one of our remote events, I believe last autumn. And we've had learnt so much from you, Adam. I can't overemphasize, and I'm sure that's why a lot of people are here, just how much respect we have for your knowledge and the role that you've played at NASEN, the National Association for Special Educational Needs. And I know a large proportion of the schools represented here will also be members of NASEN, the hugely informative products that you produce as well across the piece. And I hope you're going to be advertising your book as you speak. That's not something I say to every speaker that I introduce, but I think our members know that we've really taken it to heart. We think it's a hugely helpful, I was going to say introduction, but it's more than an introduction to the governance of SEND. And actually, with your permission, we've picked up the themes and have incorporated that in our reviewed SEND guidance, which Steve is going to say a little bit on later on. But also, you're walking the walk here, aren't you? You're a national leader of governance yourself, and a trustee at two mats. So I think probably they fall into the medium and the very big category, don't they? So a real warm welcome to you, Adam, and the stage is now yours.
That's very kind, Emma. Thank you for those kind words. I will talk a bit about the book at the very end, but I put a link in there anyway in the chat if anybody's interested to know a bit more. No, it's really kind of you to invite me to come along today, and I really enjoy getting the opportunity to talk to governance professionals and to governors, to trustees, and everybody who works in this world, because having spent the last 6 years talking to lots of other people who work and lead on SEND in different parts of schools, I've come to the realization eventually a couple of years ago that it's only when we've actually got buy-in from the most strategic level in schools and trusts, and by that I'm talking about board level, that actually you can't make progress without getting those people really on board. And so the opportunity to come and speak to colleagues in this kind of format is very much appreciated. So thank you for that. For those of you who are not already following myself or NASEN on Twitter, please do. And if you come up with a question in the middle of the night, you wish, I wish I'd asked Adam that question or whatever, then feel free to tweet it at me, and you'll get not just my response, then you'll get lots of other responses too. In terms of the kind of theme for today, we've called this from compliance to culture. If you've seen me speak before, I do have kind of several themes that I talk about quite a lot, and some of those themes I'll talk about again today. But I suppose that kind of underpinning everything I say today, this compliance to culture thing is important. I kind of think of it a little bit like when you've learned to drive a car and you've passed your test, and there's a kind of period just after you've passed your test where, yes, you can drive a car and you're allowed to do it by yourself, but you have to think really hard to kind of do it well, and you have to concentrate on everything that's going on. And then somehow over a period of time that stops, and you just automatically, instinctively know what you're doing. And I feel a little bit like that's where we are with SEND and inclusion in schools at the moment at a national level, which is, I think we're having to work really hard to actually make sure we get SEND provision right in schools. And I suppose what I'm trying to do today is to look at what things can we do at a strategic level, at board level, that could really help shift us into that kind of automatic space where the provision, the right provision in schools is is not a kind of an extra thing. It's not a bolt on as such. It's kind of built into what we routinely do all the time. So that's what we're going to try and do. And I always say with these kind of things, if everybody who's at the session today takes away just one thing that they're going to do differently, then it'll move us much more towards that culture of inclusion. Next slide, please. Just wanted to very briefly mention NASEN. So if you're not already a member of NASEN, please do join. It's free, and the website address is there. I won't say anything more than that. I'll let you look at that at your leisure. And next slide, please. We've also got the Send Gateway as well, is where we put a lot of the government-funded resources, and you automatically get that as part of membership of NASEN. Okay, next slide. Before I kind of dive into some of the very specific things around governance, I wanted to just set the scene a little bit around the context in which we're operating. So this is a graph which has collated data that's in the public domain around the prevalence of SEND over time. And the blue line at the top here is looking at the total proportion of children with SEND in our schools in England. And you can see in 2010 that peaked at around 21%. And in 2010, a number of things happened. There was a change of government. There was a change in the way that schools were funded. So up until 2010, actually, if you had more children with SEND in your school, you got more funding. And then for whatever reason, the government decided that they thought that school leaders were trying to game the system and over-identifying the number of children with SEND to try and get more money. I mean, I think it's quite disrespectful, really, to think that, but that's what they thought. And Ofsted got on the bandwagon as well, and they started saying, well, look, they produced this report which said a statement is not enough, which essentially said, schools, we think you're over-identifying the proportion of children with SEND, and so it started to drop off. And it dropped off consistently over the next 4 or 5 years. Then the Children and Families Act came in 2014, the SEND Code of Practice in 2015, and you see it drops again and again. And then it steadily increased. Now, the other two lines on this page, the green line represents those children who have SEND, but they don't have either a statement or an education, health and care plan. So in old money, that would have been those at School Action Plus, for those of you who are involved in those days. Now it's called SEN support. And you can see that almost all of the change that you see is all down to that non-statutory end. And it's the group of children I'm going to talk about a lot today, and where I think as governance colleagues, we need to focus our effort. And it's on the 80% of children with SEND who do not have the protection of an education, health and care plan. More than 1 million pupils. In fact, it's almost 1.1 million pupils in this country who fall into that category. And there are things that we can be doing at whole school level that will really help them in terms of the culture. And then the orange line at the bottom is those who do have those very complex needs, who would have had a statement in the old days, now an education, health and care plan. And that group stayed steady at 2.8% for about a decade. And over the past 3, 4, 5 years, that's steadily increased. And it's now at 3.7% as of the data that was released 2 weeks ago. So it's not quite updated on this. So there is a 2021 data now. And I should say that even that 2.8%, of course, was in the context of rising pupil numbers. So actually, although it was 2.8%, it's got in raw figures, it's gone up and up and up. And actually, the resource in general to support SEND at a national level hasn't really changed that much. And I'll come back to this data a bit later on as well, in terms of how you might be able to use this type of data in your particular school or trust. Next slide, please. At a kind of local authority level, this is data now which is a couple of years old, but the direction of travel, I think, is quite clear. And this is looking at how many local authorities are overspent on their high needs funding block. And so anything that's in red, they're the authorities that are overspending, and the blue ones under the zero are the ones that are underspending, and the darker red or the darker blue is the more that they're under or overspending. And you can see that every year, more and more local authorities overspend. And this latest data, of course, on here only goes to 2017-18. I would be surprised if there are any local authorities that are managing to keep within their means in terms of high needs funding. And what do I read into this? Well, what I read is that, yes, we hear about efficiency savings that need to be made in terms of high needs funding, but it also tells me there is a systemic problem. If every single local area in the country can't make the system work within the constraints of the funding they've got, then there is a problem. The model is not right. And certainly that was one of the points that was made with this National Audit Office report. And it's one of the things that I hope the SEND review will actually look to address. And right at the end of today's presentation, I'm going to reflect a little bit on what the SEND review is and what might come next with that. Next slide, please. Final bit of kind of setting the scene data. And I can never decide whether this is an appropriate thing to include or not, because it very much talks about boys and girls, and of course, you know, gender is not necessarily always viewed in exactly that way now. But nevertheless, this data is in the public domain, published a couple of years ago, and it essentially says if you look at every age group from 5 up to 17, and you look at the proportion of boys versus the proportion of girls that are identified with SEND, you can see the boys in red and the girls in yellow there. And essentially, the story of this graph is that there are typically double the number of proportion of boys identified to girls. Now, why is that useful for us? Well, we could ask ourselves the question: are there really more boys than girls with SEND? Is it that we're over-identifying the number of boys with SEND, or are we under-identifying the number of girls? And actually, I think it's probably the latter on balance. And there's a lot of masking that goes on. So, for example, we hear about girls with autism, where actually we don't discover they've got autism until they're in their 30s or something. And actually, they're you know, sometimes on the verge of a kind of nervous breakdown or something, because they've been coping with all of these needs and not really knowing what it was about. So it's one of the areas I think as a country we need to think really hard about, is how do we make sure that we don't miss some of those needs. And it's one of the themes I'll refer to throughout today, is this issue around accurate identification. Because if we can't identify needs accurately, we've got no chance of actually putting the right provision in place. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so a couple of questions here, and these are rhetorical questions, so don't feel that you need to answer them in the chat. But the first two questions on here are about, if I asked you the question, could you name the 4 broad areas of need from the SEND Code of Practice, and could you tell me what the 3 most prevalent areas of primary need are for pupils in your school? Would you be able to do that? Now, looking at the poll that we had earlier on, and lots of you are SEND governors and so on, probably this group, you'd be quite good at answering those questions. But I think out there in the kind of wider world of governance, when I go and ask these questions, and sometimes if I'm doing an independent review of governance or a SEND review, and I'll ask these questions, and actually it's pretty patchy. Some schools and some boards pretty good. But lots of governors will say, "Oh, we've got a SEND governor for that," or "Oh, do we need to know that? Isn't that operational or something?" You know, so there are real challenges, I think, around this. And why do I think you need to know this? Because actually, when you know the answer to those two things, it can help you be much more inclusive with the kind of strategic decisions that you make. And I'm going to talk in a short while about a principle called Think SEND, which I think is something that as governors we can adopt. And it's quite hard to do if you're just thinking about learners with SEND as one homogenous group. So rather than saying how are learners with SEND doing compared to learners without SEND, we might want to start saying, well, actually, how are our learners with speech language communication needs doing? And how does that compare to those with social, emotional, and mental health needs? And so we can have a much more nuanced discussion about that. And that's important, because if we're going to make a decision about, for example, investing in a sensory room or something like that, actually the profile of need that you've got will be quite important in that decision. And I would argue that it's important not just in decisions which are like that one, specifically about SEND and inclusion, but actually in decisions more broadly. And that's something I'll kind of, as I say, focus on as we go through today. Next slide, please. If you didn't know the 4 broad areas of need, I felt I should include them. Sorry, you need to click again for this one. So here are the 4 broad areas of need. And people will say, well, how would I have known that? How would I have found out that those were the 4 broad areas of need? And what I've got on this slide here is the copy of the SEND Code of Practice, which was published in January 2015. It's a pretty long document. It's 292 pages long. I'm certainly not expecting governors to read 292 pages, but chapter 6 of this document is 20 pages. In fact, if I take off the front cover, which is what you can see on the screen here, and the back cover, which is just about Crown copyright and stuff like that, there's only 18 pages of content. And I think it's reasonable to say, actually, should all governors be familiar with chapter 6 of the SEND Code of Practice? Yes, because then they would know about the 4 broad areas of need. And in fact, they'd know a whole host of other really useful bits of information about statutory expectations in terms of what schools should be putting in place or not. And I think that will really help in that kind of support and challenge type discussion that you will have at board, because you can ask really specific and targeted questions that relate directly to compliance with the Code of Practice. And if you're the SEND governor in particular, it's a very good way of just framing the discussions you might have at your termly one-to-ones with the SENDCO. Just to click on again, please. I've got a green box here now. And now, as we go through today, I've got a number of these green boxes, which I hope are helpful, because sometimes the things I'm talking about, there is a kind of governor aspect to it, there is a head teacher aspect to it, and there is a kind of SENDCO aspect to it, and they're not always distinct, they're a bit overlapping sometimes. So what I've tried to do with these green boxes is to summarise what I think people in those different roles should be doing, and so you can see a bit more how it fits together. So hopefully that's helpful. I won't always talk about the green boxes, but they should be helpful for you when you get the slides. Okay, next slide, please. I think this is Emma's favourite slide from when I spoke before, but and I've improved it slightly. But one of the things I get asked a lot when I talk to governors around SEND is what can we do, Adam, that will cost nothing or very little, but that will really help us to improve inclusion and SEND in our school? And I've got a few pointers here that might help. So the first one is around giving SEND an equivalent status to pupil premium. What do I mean by that? If I was to ask most governors about pupil premium, about how many students they've got with pupil premium in the school, how much money they get for it, what that money is spent, and what the impact of those interventions are, governors are pretty good at answering those kind of questions in general. And I think that's because every year they get a report which comes to the board, it has to be signed off by the board, and then it's published on a school website. If I ask those same questions about how do we spend our SEN notional budget, the answers are a lot more patchy. The SEND governor, sometimes the chair might know, but actually it's pretty patchy. And I suppose what I'm saying is, why don't we, at the same time that we're asking the school to report on pupil premium, let's find out about the SEND notional budget as well. Now, we could have a big debate about whether the SEN notional budget really exists or not, and that might be something we'll talk about afterwards. But actually there is an overlap between those at SEN support, so that's the non-statutory end of SEND I was talking about before, and those are eligible for pupil premiums. And you might think of that group as being double disadvantaged because of the SEND and the disadvantage, but then also triple funded. So there's an element of the SEN notional budget, there's the pupil premium funding, and then there's the age-weighted funding that every pupil gets. And thinking about actually how all of that money is spent together is often more useful than trying to think of them as kind of siloed bits of spend. So that doesn't cost anything necessarily, but it's about saying, actually, let's make sure we understand how we're spending the funding that we've got. The second point is around making SEND everybody's responsibility. Now, the Code of Practice talks about every teacher a teacher of SEND, and I agree with that. So sometimes people say, yeah, but because it's everybody's responsibility, it kind of lets me off the hook a bit, you know, because I don't need to worry about it because someone else is going to cover it, you know, and that's a problem. So, and you see that. So sometimes I'll go into a school and I'll see teachers saying, oh, I don't need to worry about the children we send in my class because the TA works with them, the teaching assistant, or, oh no, it's the SENDCO's job. They sort that out. And the analogy for me of where we want to be instead is safeguarding. So in a school, we will have a designated safeguarding lead, but I don't think anybody in a school would say that they don't have a role to play in safeguarding. Everybody would understand that they have a role, even though there's someone leading it. And that's what we want. We want everybody to understand that we've got a SENDCO, they are leading SEND in the school and coordinating SEND, but actually everybody has a role to play. And I think in terms of that culture point again, what can we do, particularly if you're the SEND governor, I think in terms of championing the kind of decisions that would help us to go on that journey, that's what we can do. The third point here is around every leader being a leader of SEND. So I said before, the Code of Practice talks about every teacher a teacher of SEND. In my book, to do that well, we need every leader to be a leader of SEND. And for me, leadership starts with the board, right, with us in this room. And this is why I think if actually we're not interested enough to even have read the chapter 6 and know that there are 4 broad areas of need and to ask those really much more nuanced questions, are we surprised then if actually our school leaders might say, well, I don't need to worry about SEND because I've got a SENDCO? And sometimes that is a challenge I get. I get a head teacher who will say to me, well, you know, you wouldn't expect me to know about maths because I've got a head of maths for that. Why do you expect me to know about SEND? I've got a SENDCO. And I say, because actually, if we're serious about having an inclusive culture, we need every leader in the school to be bought into that and to really understand it. So we need to get to this point where every leader is a leader of SEND. The fourth one is principle of think SEND that I've mentioned. Oh, have we put number 4 up? So this fourth one of think SEND. So this is a very simple idea, but I think could be quite powerful. And it's the idea that every time you make a strategic decision as a board, just stopping and asking yourself the question, how will this decision impact on learners with SEND in our school? And I think for some decisions that'll be obvious. So I mentioned like the sensory room one before. I don't know if you were going to think about increasing or decreasing the number of TAs or, you know, pupil staff ratio, you will obviously automatically think about youngsters with SEND. But I want you to think about it for every decision. So for example, when you're making decisions on the curriculum, when you're making decisions on the timing of the school day, and someone's putting in the chat there about this whole point about every child matters. I very much like the every child matters, and it was a great shame when that went, but I agree. But you know, if you're going to change the timing of the school day, it's not so much that the actual decision, but how you apply that decision to make it inclusive could be better, because it might be that some learners need a bit longer to actually process the change. And so we rather than say, right, we're changing it from Monday morning, we do it in a slightly different way. And it goes back to an old principle that when you get it right for learners with SEND, it's often a better decision for everybody. And it's something I learned a long time ago. I started life out as a secondary school maths teacher. And when I used to plan my lessons, I'd plan for all the students in my class. And then I'd have a look at who was on the SEND register. And I'd say, all right, I need to differentiate my lesson for those pupils. And it took me hours and hours and hours. The lesson was great, but it just took a long time. But then one day the penny dropped, which was that if I planned my lesson so it worked for the learners with SEND in the first place, it worked for everybody else anyway, and it was often a better lesson. And I think that same principle applies for strategic decisions as well. If we think about making those decisions so they work for learners with SEND, they will be a better decision for everybody, and I call that think SEND. The last one on here is around maximising the impact of the SENDCO, and I'll talk about the SENDCO a fair bit today, because I think the SENDCO is the linchpin in terms of what we need to do to get SEN support right. And I've got some research which I'll draw on a bit later, but essentially what we found is that SENDCOs are a very valuable resource in the school. They're highly qualified. They have to be a qualified teacher. They have to have this level 7 master's level award. But then actually they spend their time mostly on paperwork. In fact, typically collating evidence for education, health and care plan requests. And they don't have enough time to undertake the role that they've got. And it varies quite a lot between schools. But what I would say is if you've got your SENDCO spending most of their time on paperwork, then that is a very expensive administrator. And I suppose what I'd be saying is, what could we do to try and free that SENDCO up to really focus on the quality of teaching and learning? So, for example, could we give them some admin support to actually lift them out of some of that, so they can actually get in there and help develop that inclusive teaching and learning. And then I've got another green box on here, which covers some of the points I've made. The only one I've not talked about in that green box is co-production. And if you're not familiar with that term, this is about equal, meaningful partnerships between families and between the school-based professionals. And I would just ask you to reflect on where you are. So are you a school that does things to families? You know, this is how it's going to be. Or do you do it for families where there are learners with SEND, or do we do it with them? And I think most schools are somewhere between the done for and done with, and it depends on the decision and the particular interactions and the particular families and so on. So it's the question, the challenge, I suppose, is how do we make sure it's always done with? And as I said at the beginning, not because we consciously have to do that, but because we automatically do that. And I think that's hard, but it's something we need to work on. Okay, next slide, please. Now, talk about every leader or leader of SEND. You might need to click on a few of these points. So this chapter 6 of the Code of Practice, Malcolm Reeve, who's a colleague of mine, talks about the fact that in chapter 6, it says, school leaders and teaching staff, including the SENDCO, should identify any patterns in the identification of SEN. And why is that important? Because it doesn't say the SENDCO should identify patterns in SEN. It says school leaders and teaching staff, and then the SENDCO is almost, including the SENDCO, is almost an add-on there. And that's interesting, because I think typically it's the SENDCO that's leading on this stuff, and it just reinforces that point around every leader of SEND and every teacher of SEND. So we all, that really is everybody's responsibility. And then it talks about doing those comparisons with national data, and I'll come back to that later on. But the point is that we need to use that to reinforce the high quality teaching for all pupils. And it's just that message again, that when we actually have a more inclusive teaching and learning offer, it is a much better offer for everybody. Okay, next slide, please. I wanted to just share a couple of specific resources here that that just would help if you're interested in some of the things we've just talked about. So there's one here called Every Leader, a Leader of SEND. It's obvious which one that applies to, but it's really important because in the Ofsted framework, it talks about no school can be graded outstanding unless they can also demonstrate that they're inclusive. In other words, they're outstanding for every child, including those with SEND. But then you might ask yourself, well, how do we demonstrate that we're an inclusive school? Well, this guide, which is available from the SEND Gateway, sendgateway.org.uk, and it's free, you can just download it. It allows you to kind of think about how you do that in your school, and gives you some useful benchmarks that you can look at. Similarly, for those who are thinking about if you're a school leader, and you, I know your governor's here, but if you know that your school leader is interested in the deployment of SENDCOs, and getting the most out of them, then there's a useful guide there. And lastly, if you're a SEND governor in particular, this SENDCO induction pack, it's actually aimed at new SENDCOs, but lots of SEND governors have said to us, this was a really useful document in helping me to understand the job that the SENDCO does and the language, and there's so many acronyms. I mean, there's acronyms in education anyway, but when you get education and SEND as well, it's just very, very complex. But this was quite useful, and it gives you some kind of some background in terms of the law and policy and a whole range of other things, and it's real nuts and bolts stuff, but it's a good starting point. Okay, next slide, please. You can just reveal all the questions on here. So there are 5 questions here, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, so you get a copy of them with the slides. And really what I wanted to put these on for was that some governors will say to me, we don't really talk a lot about SEND in our board. I'm not quite sure where to start. And these are quite useful starting points. So these are kind of 5 quite general questions, which you could probably ask in any school. And they're just a useful starting point. And these might give you kind of some lines of inquiry, to use an Ofsted phrase, to go down. Okay, next slide, please. Talked earlier on about ethos and culture, a big part of what we need to do as a board. Sorry, can we just remove the second bullet for a second? Is that all right? Thank you. Otherwise, it gets a bit complicated on this one. And this, in this next couple of slides, I want to try and convince you that one of the things we need to do as a board is to focus a bit more on the kind of environment and the context of a school, rather than just the individuals. And there's this thing, if you've not heard about it, about the medical model of SEND and the social model of SEND. And so if I just briefly explain what they are, and then I'll get into this example. So the medical model of SEND is, as it suggests, you look at a particular individual and you say, right, we've noticed that they can't do X, whatever X is. So it might be they've got a physical disability and so they can't walk, or they're not learning in a particular way, or they can't write, or whatever it is. There's something they can't do. It's a deficit. And then we say, well, well, now we've diagnosed this, quite medical language, how can we kind of, in inverted commas, fix the individual? And that's a very medicalized approach. And we've very much in education moved away from that. And we've gone towards a more social model. And the social model is less about the individual, but it's more about the wider environment. And there's a real tension between these two because they keep butted up against each other. But in my opinion, as a board, we can't get involved in individual cases, of course, because we're trying to be strategic, but we can do quite a lot on the social side. So I just wanted to just share this couple of examples for this. So first of all, I wanted you to imagine you lived in a world where 2% of people had the superpower that they could fly, okay? However, 98% of people in this world can't fly, okay? And you're in the 98%, so you can't fly, but there's this 2% that can. And the question is, would you consider yourself in that context to have a disability because you can't fly? Now, I've asked this question a lot at conferences, and the general consensus is, well, no. In fact, I'd probably say this 2%, well done. They've obviously got some extraordinary talent that they've learned how to fly. Well done them. But, you know, I'm not overly concerned. Next bullet, please. Now I want you to imagine that we're in a world where 98% of people can fly, but you're in the 2% that cannot. Would you now consider yourself to have a disability? And again, when I ask this question, the broad consensus is, well, probably, yeah, because I'm in the minority of people. Most people have got this ability to fly and I can't. You know, I'd be wondering, what have I done? Why is it me that can't do this? And so yes, and what's interesting about scenario 1 and scenario 2 here is that nothing about the individual has changed. And you couldn't fly in scenario 1, you still can't fly in scenario 2. But in one context you would have a disability, in the other one not. Now, why is that? Probably because in scenario 2, the world around you is built for people who can fly. So the schools and the supermarkets are probably in the sky or something, and you can't access them. And so it comes back to that point again around really focusing on the wider environment, because when we build the supermarkets and the schools on the ground instead of the sky, then everybody can access them, and it didn't matter whether they could fly or not. And that's the thing that we really need to focus on as a board. What can we change in the wider environment of the school to raise what I call the level of ordinarily available provision, so that actually fewer children effectively have SEND? So you can actually reduce the number of children on your SEND register by looking at the environment. So just really, hopefully it's quite a bit philosophical, but hopefully it makes you think. Just the next point, please. There's an interesting point here which we won't have time to look at today, which is at what percentage, if you like, as you're going from scenario 1 to scenario 2, does it become a disability? So is it 50%? Is it 70%? And you know, it's probably a big debate we can have on that. Next slide, please. Just taking this a little bit further. You've probably seen this slide before, this difference between equality and equity. And you might think of these crates as being bundles of resource that you can kind of allocate at a strategic level. And you know, the argument is that in the first example here, you could give everybody the same resource, and it, you know, for some it's not enough, and for some it's arguably too much. You weight the resource towards those that need it more, and that's the equity model. Now, what's interesting about these two is they're both medical, and one's a better model than the other in a sense, but they're both about fixing the individual still. What do I need to do to kind of prop up the individual to make it work for them? So thinking about this, the social model, why would that be different? If we could just click, please. Then rather than, you know, focus the bundles of resources on the crates, why don't we use that resource to remove the fence altogether? And that's the difference between the medical model and the social model. If actually we change that wider environment and we literally remove the barrier to participation, then it doesn't matter anymore. And this is what I've really been thinking over the past 12, 18 months about this. I think this is where boards can have a really big impact, which is, what are those things? What are those barriers? Do we know what they are? And can we identify them and remove them? And that's where we should spend our resource, because we can get the biggest return on investment. That's how we get that real culture of SEND and inclusion. Okay, next slide, please. I wanted to just do a few data points on here. So this is a graph from the Education Endowment Foundation, and essentially what this is showing is that the gap in progress and attainment well, attainment actually, is biggest between those with SEN and those without SEN, even more so than it is about disadvantaged and free school meals and gender and everything else. And when I saw this, I thought, well, yeah, but that doesn't surprise me, because by definition, those with SEN are not going to have the same kind of academic outcomes. That's how we kind of decide whether they're SEN or not. And I started thinking about what I said at the beginning about that much more nuanced approach. We don't just want SEND and non-SEND in that sense. And so I thought it was useful to share something that I've been doing with some of my primary schools, which I think is also applicable in secondary as well. Next slide, please. So sometimes in the primary boards I sit on, I'll see data presented something like this. You might be slightly different in your school, but essentially you get something which says this is the proportion of children meeting the expected standard nationally for reading, writing and maths. This is the proportion of children achieving higher standard and greater depth. And you get that nationally, you get it for pupils in the school, and then there's a breakdown of what it looks like for those with SEND and those without SEND. And in a sense, I kind of look at this, and I suppose I look at the group of SEND and I think, okay, I'm just looking at that top line there, 47%, and I compare it with, the 75%, or compare it with any of the other three figures. And you say, well, at what point would I get worried about that? So if it was 10%, would I be worried? So in a sense, it's going to be lower, but how low is too low? And I think that's a really hard judgment for us to make as board. And so one of the things I've been advocating is actually being a bit more nuanced and breaking that SEND down into two categories. Next slide, please. Those two categories are cognitive and non-cognitive SEND. Now you might say, well, I don't know what that means. And so I'll try and explain it if you just click for me. So by cognitive SEND, every January, your school will submit data to the national census. And you have to, for every child with SEND, you have to determine what their primary area of need is. Now, this is I'm oversimplifying this probably here, because of course lots of students will have co-occurring needs and so on. But for those students who have a primary area of need, which is one of these three, PMLD, SLD or MLD, I would argue that they have cognitive SEND, which means that by definition, they will not make the same levels of academic progress as other students. Okay, that because of the condition they've got. However, I would argue that for every other area, so what's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 of the 14 that are on there, that counts as non-cognitive SEND. And just because someone's got a vision impairment or a hearing impairment or mental health needs, for example, does that mean that they should make less academic progress than an attainment than their peers? And I'm not sure it does. And so when I look at this table now, and I'm just looking at the top line again, and I see non-cognitive SEND 52%, actually as a governor now, I say, actually, I would like to challenge that. I'm a bit worried, because that suggests we've got an accessibility issue there, because that should be as good as, if not better, than national. And what's also interesting is before we didn't know actually just how low some of the attainment might have been for those with cognitive SEND, because it was kind of artificially inflated because everyone with SEND was in together. So then we might say, well, we're still with that problem. Is 10% too low or not? So one of the things, next slide, please, I say that we should do for those with cognitive SEND is lots of those children will have EHC plans. Some might not. They might have something like an individual education plan. We don't want to get into individual cases, of course, but as a governor, would it be useful for us to know what proportion of children are on track to meet the targets that are specified in those plans? And those targets may be academic, but they may be non-academic. There may be things in there about preparation for adulthood and learning to live independently, and they'll be individual, of course. But I think as a governor, we want a sense of, are students on track to achieve those targets? And looking at how that measure changes over time, I think is much more useful to us in a sense than the 10% figure on the previous slide. So both have a role, but arguably that's important. Next slide, please. Now, the other bit of thing you can do with the national data that you get, the census data, is that you get this this data from the January census. It gets published in July, and it gets published also by regional and national data as well. So you can compare your school in terms of prevalence and profile of need to what's going on regionally and nationally. Now, I'm not suggesting it has to be the same, but I think it's a good way of kind of leading into asking some interesting questions. So this is an invented school, this Lady Villetta High School, but if you look at the top the top category here, SEN support but no specialist assessment of type of need. Well, it looks pretty high in this school compared to what's going on regionally, and it's marginally higher than what's going on nationally. And that might lead me to say, well, is there an issue around accuracy of identification, particularly because the one below it is the same, other difficulty or disability. And second from bottom then, moderate learning difficulty is sometimes inappropriately used as a bit of a catch-all. Well, we know that they're learning, you know, they're not making as much progress. There's probably an SEM, we're not quite sure what it is. We'll put it down as moderate learning difficulty. Now, I'm generalising there, but you get the point. But as governors, you can ask some interesting questions about that. So actually, how do we know that our identification is accurate? What do we benchmark it against? How do we moderate it? Other things you might look at in here, if I look at the biggest bar here, which is around speech language communication, I notice that the schools data is much lower than what's going on regionally and nationally. So we might say, is that because we're really good at identifying and meeting the needs of students with speech language communication needs, and so therefore there are few of them on the register? Is it because we've missed lots of them, and so there are, you know, the identification is not good enough? And if I look at the one below it, social, emotional, mental health needs, that's particularly high. Are they actually children with unmet speech language communication needs? So it may be different. It could be the data itself doesn't tell you the story, but I think it gets you into that nuanced discussion of really meaningful questions from the board. Someone's asked about where you can get the data. So obviously you'll have your own data because you submit it to the census in January. So you will have that in school. In terms of the regional and national data, that gets published on the DFE website every July. In fact, it was actually published in June this year, and there was one year I think it was published in August, but generally July. And you can get data that goes back at least 10 years. And if you just do a search for DFE SEN census data, it will come up as the first one. So yeah. Next slide, please. I've been going on about accuracy of identification, and the reason for that is I just wanted to share this graph because it's from the Timpson review into school exclusions. And if you look at the big 4 bars here, and ignore all the orange dots and things, but these big 4 bars are basically the areas of need where if you have SEND, you're more likely to be permanently excluded. And 2 of the big 4 are, you know, social, emotional, mental health needs, behavioural difficulties, and so on. So I suppose we might expect that. But actually 2 of the big 4, in fact, the biggest one, SEN type not recorded, and the other one is no specialist assessment. And in fact, not far behind that is other difficulty and disability. So there is a direct straight line from actually we failed to identify and accurately what the needs are to, right, child is permanently excluded because of the behaviours. So if you're a school where there are challenges around exclusions, then you might think of accuracy identification as a place to start. Next slide, please. There is this general issue, I think, nationally, you know, at government level around behaviour and inclusion. I see behaviour as a particularly challenging behaviour as a form of communication, communicating what needs are. But actually, the government's got obviously bits of government working on zero tolerance behaviour policies and mobile phone bans and behaviour hubs and all of this. So you've got all of that stuff going on in one place, and then you've got all the stuff going on with the SEND review and inclusion, and the 2 don't really match up. So there is a national tension there, and I think we probably experience that in schools. If I can skip over the next slide, please, and go to the one after. Thank you. Just quickly wanted to mention this. This is something which I talk about in the book a bit, and it's this idea that we have to make some pretty hard decisions as governors, and I think they're ethically challenging because sometimes we're in a position where, you know, there's a limited resource. We either spend it on A or B, and whichever one we do, someone loses out. And sometimes it can be, you know, we spend the money on one learner with more complex needs, or we spend the money on several learners with less complex needs, and there's no right scenario. So I just thought these 3 ethical reflection tools might be helpful, just so you can sleep easy at night. The first one is what I call it the public test, sometimes known as the newspaper test, and it's the idea that if the decision that you're making as a board and all of the evidence available to you was published on the front page of a national newspaper, would you feel confident still in defending a decision that you've made? And if the answer is yes, then don't worry too much in that sense. The second one is the parent test. And the idea is you think about if you were giving advice to somebody who's having to make the same decision as you, and that's somebody being your child or a close member of the family or something like that, what advice would you give to them? Now that's useful because it kind of depersonalizes it, but it also works on the basis that the advice you would give to somebody else, often you have a higher ethical bar for other people than we do for ourselves, which is quite interesting bit of psychology. And then the third one is the pillow test, sometimes known as the sleep test, which is, can you sleep easy at night with the decision that you've made? And you know, there's not an exact science here, but I think if you're really grappling with a hard decision, this might not be a bad kind of set of self-reflection tools to think about as a board. Okay, next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a long time on legislation, but I just wanted to flag to you these 3 bits of legislation that I think all governors should be familiar with. So I've already talked about Chapter 6 of the SEND Code of Practice. The Equality Act, which is where it talks about things like reasonable adjustments. Now, you might say, well, the governors need to know about that because isn't that operational? Now, reasonable adjustments are an anticipatory duty, which means that you can't wait for somebody to come along with a certain type of needs and then say, oh, well, we can't meet needs. Because the argument will be, could you have reasonably expected that at some point you might have a learner with those types of needs? And if so, why didn't you kind of plan and make, you know, for when that happened? So, and that therefore it becomes a strategic issue. So I think that's an important one for boards to be aware of. And there's also things in there about having an accessibility plan. If you're going to have an accessibility plan, I'd say also that the ones I see are really good on ramps and lifts, but they're less good on the kind of emotional accessibility and mental accessibility. And with mental health being a big focus, particularly in secondary schools at the moment, that's something to be really aware of. And then lastly, the Children and Families Act. You don't really need to read that particularly, because most of what you need to know is actually in the SEND Code of Practice, but I think to know its existence is useful. Next slide, please. Talked earlier on about the SENDCO. I just want to reflect briefly on this. There's a real tension, I think. I know we have it at board level sometimes, don't we, which is, you know, we must be strategic all the time. The SENDCO role has to be kind of strategic and operational in equal measure, and it changes quite a lot over time. And if anything, I think the operational overtakes sometimes what SENDCOs need to do in terms of being strategic. And I suppose if you're the SEND governor in particular and you're having those conversations with the SENDCO, I think sometimes asking them about actually what are you spending your time on? Are you able to be strategic enough? And then if not, you know, what can the board do with the head teacher to actually help that to happen? Just an important point. Now the next 3 slides I'm not going to go over, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that there is a workforce survey. Every year we do a survey of SENDCOs, and in that survey it essentially says that SENDCOs don't have enough time to do the job, that they're not often enough part of the leadership team. So therefore, you know, that principle of think SEND, imagine if your SENDCO is part of the leadership team, if your SENDCO routinely attends board, they'll tell you, they'll do it for you. They'll say, oh yeah, that's a good decision, but we need to do it this way to make sure it's really inclusive. So it's a really good thing to do to make sure your SENDCO can have that strategic influence that we want them to have. So I've just put a link to that, and there's multiple surveys on there. But it's something you might want to have a look at afterwards, which is why I wanted to just share that with you. And can you go to the slide which says SEND review now, please, which is just a couple of slides after this. That's it, SEND review, thanks. And you can reveal all the points on here. So this is my last kind of substantive slide before I just share a couple of resources. Oh, slightly too far. So if you're not familiar with this, the government has recognised, I think, that when the SEND reforms took place in 2014, which is when the Children and Families Act, followed by the SEND Code of Practice came in, they were the right reforms. They kind of said all the right things, but it didn't kind of work. Why didn't it work? It didn't work because there wasn't enough funding in the system. So they were trying to introduce the reforms at a time when there were real terms budget cuts in schools. It wasn't sufficiently tied into bigger changes that were happening at the time. So, you know, there was a big process of academisation. What you know, there wasn't a requirement for every school converting to an academy to say, actually, this is what we needed to do in terms of sending inclusion as well. And also the accountability system was kind of flawed. So, and it still is to a certain extent, it kind of penalises schools that want to be inclusive. And so the SEND magnets, as I call them, those schools which everybody in the area knows that that's the school to get your children if you want to have their needs met, they get clobbered by the accountability system. So there is an issue there. So this SEND review is coming. Now, in theory, it was supposed to be out before June, the politicians' spring, which I think even by politician standard, July is quite late. I'd be surprised if we see it before Christmas, to be frank. But when it does eventually come, the SEND review, I think, is really going to look hard at identifying some of the challenges of implementation of the 2014 reforms and to address those. So just to pull out a couple of points, because some of them I've kind of looked at as we've gone through, but local authorities, they are currently both set the threshold locally for accessing an education, health and care plan, but then they also have to pay for the provision and commission the resource. So there's an active disincentive there to under-identify. So that's an issue and they need to be separated out, which I hope the review will do. There are these disparities in provision. So 2 children with very similar types of needs just don't get the same type of support. SEN support, that group I keep going on about, the government didn't set out a minimum expectation of what every school should provide. And I think they should do that. It's hard to do, but I think as soon as you do that, I think it just helps manage expectations on teachers of what they should be providing, on families of what they can expect, and on local authorities about, you know, what they need to build on in terms of more complex needs. And the reason it wasn't in the SEND reforms before was because there was this idea that by identifying a minimum requirement, there'd be a kind of race to the bottom and everybody would just do the minimum, which I think is, again, disrespectful to school leaders. In practice, of course, by not identifying a minimum, there is no bottom. So you get the SEND magnets at one end and you get those at the other end who actively avoid taking any children with SEND on. And that's where you get all these big disparities in provision. I've talked about identification exclusions, and just a point on higher education, which is that universities are exempt from the SEND code of practice, which is quite strange because further education is included. So yeah, I think it's a bit odd, but hopefully that's a quirk that'll be ironed out. Next slide, please. Last couple of slides here. These are just some resources. So we've got this big suite of review guides, which are all on the SEND gateway and well worth having a look at. They're all editable as well, so you can so if you want to kind of self-assess or review your SEND provision, there's a governor one there, the second one down, about actually how good are we at being inclusive as a board. And so it's quite a good thing to just a benchmark against. And off the back of that, I've seen lots of governing bodies produce a governance action plan specifically around SEND. So it's a really good thing to do. Can I go 2 slides, please? A couple of resources to watch out for. So this is the Gateway website I mentioned before. The Developmental Language Disorder resources in the Autism Resource Suite, we developed those with the Autism Education Trust and ICANN, the Speech Language Communication Charity. These are more to signpost to your SENDCO more than anything, but they're really good resources. And coming soon is this Classroom Teacher SEND Handbook, which looked at both conditions and subjects together. So if you've got a youngster with ADHD and you're teaching Year 9 maths, you know, what specifically might you do differently? And to me, it's a huge, huge resource. But again, just to be aware of, all free, all funded, so you might make your SENDCO aware of those. And final slide, as I promised at the beginning, gentle plug for the book. So it discusses some of the themes I've talked about today, but there's lots and lots of other things in there that I just haven't had time to cover today. But you can obviously get that if you so wish. I'll let others comment on whether they think it's any good or not, but the feedback has been very positive. And then last slide is just to say thank you very much. Again, my Twitter handles there, my email addresses and so on are there. I hope that's been useful, and I just go back to that point at the beginning, which is if everybody here kind of takes away just one thing they're going to do differently, then that will impact on a large number of children, and not just those with SEND. I just finished on this quote from Apple. So Apple, on the accessibility device tools on their devices, so things like the voice control and things like that, they talk about those accessibility tools as being vital for some and valuable for all. And I think that's the kind of space we want to get into. You know, if we get SEND provision right, then actually for some students that's going to be vital, but it will actually help every single pupil in the school. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. I shall stop talking there and look forward to having a bit of discussion with others. Thank you.